Someday they'll go down together. They'll bury them side by side. To few, it'll be grief. To the law, a relief. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. The trail end, Bonnie Parker. This video is being released about 90 years to the day, May 23rd, 1934, when one of the most notorious and romanticized criminal duos in American history, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, met their bloody endings in Beanville Parish in northern Louisiana. Despite the clean verse of Bonnie's The Trail End poem, released to newspapers just weeks before their death, the real story of Bonnie and Clyde is complicated. During their years on the lam while committing armed bank robberies in 1932 and 1933, they were occasionally treated as heroic figures who tragically represented the downtrodden regular Americans suffering the worst of the Great Depression. When their crime waves got darker and bloodier and began to result in the murders of innocent robbery victims and multiple detectives and constables, their reputations rose to the level of America's most wanted and dangerous criminals. Ultimately, the lives of Bonnie and Clyde ended violently in a tremendous barrage of bullets outside the town of Gibbsland, Louisiana. Even after that spectacular ending to their crime spree, they were seen as folk heroes by some, with townspeople in Arcadia, Louisiana, mobbing the couple looking for souvenirs in their bullet-strewn car. Later, their individual funerals in Dallas, Texas were attended by a combined 35,000 people. Of course, much of the interest and knowledge of the criminal duo was shaped by the 1967 New Hollywood film Bonnie and Clyde, directed by Arthur Penn and starring Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty in the title roles. The film was mostly a critical and box office success, with some dissension. The New York Times Review called it a cheap piece of bald-faced slapstick comedy, and initial panned reviews in The New Yorker and Time magazine were later updated with more glowing reviews after second viewings. Ushering in a new era of filmmaking, Bonnie and Clyde was controversial upon its release for its graphic violence and strong sexual overtones, covered in the film co-written by three-time Oscar winner Robert Benton and David Newman, with some script doctoring assistance from the great Robert Towne. The movie earned 10 Academy Award nominations. Although acting nominations for Beatty and Dunaway didn't result in Oscars at the 1968 ceremony, they would remain crucial participants in the Academy Award ceremony for the next half-century.
La La Land.
There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
This episode of When the Pictures Got Bigger, we'll be looking at the pivotal role the real-life Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow played in Hollywood's depiction of criminal activity, including the strengthening of the Hays Code with the Breen Amendment, enacted just weeks after Bonnie and Clyde's violent deaths. And we'll also examine how Arthur Penn's landmark 1967 movie chipped away at that decades-long set of Hollywood rules, ultimately resulting in a 360-degree turn that helped usher in an era of groundbreaking movies in the 1970s. In a lot of ways, Hollywood's issues with crime films can be bookended by Bonnie and Clyde. And that's what we're going to look at today. Let's start with the titular couple themselves. Although there is some question about when and where Bonnie Parker first met the recently paroled Clyde Barrow, Arthur Penn's 1967 film fantasizes an initial meeting where a naked Bonnie spots the young, well-dressed car thief from her bedroom window. That's almost entirely fictional. Most accounts put the date sometime in January 1930, when Bonnie would have been 19 and 3 years into a marriage with another thief, Roy Thornton, and Clyde was 20. Bonnie stayed married to Thornton throughout her 4-year dalliance with Clyde, never even removing her wedding ring, but the married couple never saw each other again after she met Clyde Barrow. As Bonnie and Clyde commenced their criminal activities together, Hollywood already had a code of acceptable themes and imagery in the growing film industry, the infamous Hays Code. But at the time, it was more of a suggestion than actual standards, and in fact, they wouldn't truly be enforced until 1934. These pre-code films between 1930 and 1934 offered a cheap form of release to the millions of Americans struggling to find jobs, living quarters, or even meals. And it was generally understood by film studios that producing nickel or dime admission movies that skirted around the suggested Hays Code restrictions was something that its audiences wanted and would support. Although Hollywood pre-code films often tested the self-policing powers of motion picture studios, it was also during these early years of the 1930s that the gangster genre first became popular. These films tended to glorify criminal activity, a genre which certainly coincided with the rise of American crime during the Great Depression. A trio of popular gangster movies released in 1931 and 1932: Scarface, The Public Enemy, and Little Caesar. In addition to sometimes basing the main characters of these films on real-life criminals, Paul Muni's Italian immigrant Antonio "Tony" Camonte in Scarface was certainly based on the real-life Al Capone. These movies also helped lead to the rise of such popular movie actors as James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson. But how does this relate to Bonnie and Clyde? Well, looking at Bonnie's diaries from the time, you can see many entries on her lifelong fascination with films and movie stars of the time, and failed dreams of becoming a movie star herself. Certainly, the real-life exploits of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow would effectively transfer to the big screen, something that was also done at the B level in 1958's The Bonnie Parker Story, and then again in 2019 in The Highwaymen. The latter movie approaches the story from the perspectives of the Texas Rangers hunting down the duo, Frank Hamer and Mamie Gault. I haven't seen the 1958 Bonnie Parker Story, but I definitely need to see it one day. I know Quentin Tarantino has said that Whitney is, quote, one of the greatest action directors in the history of the business. If you were a moviegoer in 1934 during the most prolific final months of the duo's killing and robbery spree, the way you likely would have learned about the pair was in movie newsreels, with this Dallas-produced reenactment showing some of the most horrific acts committed by Bonnie and Clyde. The footage and newspaper headlines put additional state and federal lawmen on the trail of the duo, and meant that Hollywood also now felt the pressure to stop glorifying the gangster actions in roles such as Scarface or The Public Enemy. It was irresponsible. As the real-life posse chasing the Barrow Gang tightens its grip in April and May 1934, so too did Hollywood change its practices with the insertion of Breen into the head position of the Production Code Administration. Some of these changes after Bonnie and Clyde included the fact that Hollywood was told they could not produce movies depicting the stories of John Dillinger or Pretty Boy Floyd, criminals who led even deadlier encounters than Bonnie and Clyde, and who also were similarly gunned down by officers within a few months of the duo's May 1934 deaths. The Hollywood gangster films definitely suffered in the 1940s and 1950s, with fewer movies in that genre being made overall. The ones that were given agency approval for release were done with watered-down violence or perhaps with the criminal behavior serving as reflections of deeper metaphors about American life. As an example of this shift, AFI's 2008 list of the top 10 gangster films ever made offers just one movie made between 1932 and 1966. Bonnie and Clyde, by the way, is number 5 on that list, and the aforementioned 1931 and 32 trio of Scarface, Public Enemy, and Little Caesar are 6, 8, and 9. In the 1932 to 1966 film, by the way, is Raoul Walsh's White Heat, which comes in at a well-deserved number 4. One could even argue that White Heat is more a character study of James Cagney's Cody Jarrett than a smorgasbord of criminal activity on screen. It's not like gangster films weren't being made in Hollywood during this time period. In fact, some were, and they were quite well made. Several even offered tamer versions of the Bonnie and Clyde's gangsters on the run tail. Nicholas Ray's directorial debut in 1948 of They Live by Night, or the Henry Fonda, Sylvia Sidney 1937 offering of You Only Live Once would be good options for those interested in the genre to see what Hollywood was producing at the time. But those films seem timid in comparison to what will come later with the only true criminal activity happening off-screen. It wasn't until 1967 when, ironically, the couple that helped push the genre out of the theaters back in 1934 returned to screens with a vengeance, issuing in the new Hollywood approach to grittier filmmaking with deeper themes. Hoping to write a screenplay together, writers Newman and Benton had each read John Toland's History of Depression-era Criminals, The Dillinger Days, and Benton's Texas childhood particularly made him a fan of Bonnie and Clyde. Everybody in Texas grew up with Bonnie and Clyde. Benton is quoted in Mark Harris's classic book, Pictures at a Revolution. My father was at their funeral. You'd go to a Halloween party as a kid, and some boy would always be dressed as Clyde, and some girl would be dressed as Bonnie. The duo put together a 75-page treatment of the romantic couple's story, and they were able to get it circulated to some in the entertainment industry. It eventually ended up in the hands of the director Arthur Penn, who had gained acclaim for his 1962 film The Miracle Worker, and who had directed A Young Beatty in the 1965 thriller Mickey 1. Filming began in 1966 in North Central Texas, and the movie was released in theaters on August 13, 1967. To best understand the significance of Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, you should probably start with the ending. Even if you've never seen Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, although I certainly hope that you have, you're likely familiar with its iconic climactic scene. It's so well known that I feel I don't need to warn you in advance of showing it here. But if you need the spoiler warning, please skip forward about 30 seconds. There are slight historical inaccuracies from the movie compared to the real-life story. For instance, there's no evidence that Clyde Barrow walked out of the Ford V8 he was driving with Bonnie to help their henchman's father repair a flat tire. Bonnie and Clyde's 1967 release was kind of the sweet spot between the Hays Code and the later rating system in the 1970s. As Louis Menand wrote in The New Yorker, 2 years earlier, the movie would not have been approved. 2 years later, it would have been rated X. The Benton, Newman, and Town script also covered other controversial themes that challenged viewers. The sexual tension and energy between the young and beautiful film leads was hard to forget, especially when combined with the glamorized criminal behavior. In the initial manuscript, Beatty's Clyde Barrow was written as a bisexual character, although that element was ultimately stripped from the final film release. Adding the banjo-dominated score in the film certainly created a sensory overload with its audiences. The barriers that had held back the gangster film in Hollywood for more than 3 decades were certainly broken down by Arthur Penn in the 1967 offering, with further cracks in that wall coming later from film directors Francis Ford Coppola, Brian De Palma, and Martin Scorsese. Although it's been 90 years, the romantic attraction of Bonnie and Clyde has never really strayed far from audiences. Their story has been retold in numerous songs, Broadway musicals, and one can visit the historical landmarks of their real-life escapades in Louisiana, Nevada, Iowa, Missouri, and Texas. The art form that was just coming into its own as Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were coming of age helped shape their historical legacy, and the most famous celluloid depiction of their lives also happened to shape film. The film medium can enhance storytelling or distort the best of the medium often accomplishes both. And so as we say goodbye to Bonnie and Clyde, perhaps we should let some more of Miss Bonnie Parker's words finish the video. If you're still in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow Gang. I'm sure you have all read how they rob and steal, and those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There's lots of untruths to these write-ups. They're not as ruthless as that. Their nature is raw, they hate all the law, the stool pigeons, spotters, and rats. They don't think they're too smart or desperate. They know the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. For almost a century now, the permanently entwined tales of Bonnie and Clyde have captivated audiences. They've thrilled, intrigued, and angered followers, and it's safe to say that film audiences have likely not seen the last of the duo. Thanks for joining me on today's video journey with Mr. Barrow and Miss Parker. Until the next time, I'll see you at the movies.